Thank you, Mr Deputy Chair. And I rise today to speak about the 1980s, the heady days of the 1980s, and pretty much what was the cultural flavour of the day, which was neoliberalism. And I think it's quite relevant. I'd planned to do this speech anyway, but it's actually quite relevant in light of all the insults thrown at me by the other side over the weekend, calling me a cooker because I want to help parents raise their own children. Because unlike those on the other side who seem to be incapable of rational debate, I think we do have a cost of living crisis in this country, and more importantly, we have a parenting and stay-at-home problem. Because I totally agree that it is very difficult for a one working parent family to actually be able to pay the mortgage today. And that is why I rise to speak, because I actually want to deal with the issue of house prices in this country and the issue of productivity. Now, you may find it strange a Liberal senator getting up and speaking against the neoliberal ideology of the 1980s, but you shouldn't be, because if you read Robert Menzies' 1942 Forgotten People speech, you will see in his last paragraph he says we should not go back to the old and selfish notions of laissez-faire. There will be more control, not less of it. And that's very important, because the role of a good government and a good politician is to protect the people and their families. And it is also the role of a good politician to stand up to the unrestrained authority of the institutions, whether it's superannuation funds, banks, politicians, bureaucrats or corporations. And what we've seen in the last 4 or 5 decades is this rolling over to the institutions, these institutions who are, basically unaccountable. I mean, how many times I've had the words, "Oh, it's commercial in confidence," government money that's been spent, paid to a company, and the term "it's commercial in confidence" thrown back at me. I couldn't tell you, but it's too many times, because ultimately any taxpayer dollars that have been spent on government on contracts with the private sector should be totally transparent. But anyway, I want to talk about the financial deregulation of the 1980s and get very specific about some of the things that happened. And what brought me to this is just recently I'm calling for the re-establishment of a public bank. And some of the blowback I get is, "Oh, we can't have governments running banks. Look at what happened to the Victorian State Bank, Victoria in the 1990, I think it was." And I did go back and looked at why the Victorian State Bank collapsed in the late 80s, early 90s, and it was because they went and bought a merchant bank, Tricontinental, and it was the losses from the Tricontinental purchase that actually brought the entire state bank down. Now, if you'd have had proper banking regulations that had prevented the government bank from getting involved with a merchant bank, that would not have happened. And if ever there was a time you did not want to get involved with a merchant bank, it was the late 80s, with the heady debt levels and gearing ratios of the late 80s. Who can forget the Bonds and the Scases of the world and some of the astronomical losses that occurred in the late 80s? But that is very, very important to point out, because if we didn't deregulate the financial sector, and I just want to be careful here about what I talk about because it is a question of degree, things like that wouldn't have happened. But the other thing, another aspect of the deregulation was that capital controls were lifted. And what that means is, and by foreign capital controls, in 1985 the 4 major banks had $8 billion in foreign debt. By 2008 they had $800 billion in foreign debt, because there were no restrictions on what the local banks could go out and borrow offshore. And that obviously ended up when they could go and borrow as much money as they like. They did. And what happened with that $800 billion that they borrowed was they lent it to people who wanted to buy houses. And that, of course, sent house prices up to 12 to 13 times earnings from what was initially in 1985, house prices were around 4 to 5 times earnings. And when you put house prices up to 12 to 13 times earnings, or double the price of a house relative to income, you will invariably end up with 2 parents going back to work. And of course that's exactly what has happened over the last 30 or 40 years. We've had 2 parents now who have to go back to work. And when 2 parents have to go back to work, that means we have to put our child into childcare, and I want to distinguish childcare I'm talking institutionalised childcare here. I'm not talking kindergartens. I'm not talking 5-day fortnights or anything like that. When you get 4 or 5, I've got no problem with kids going off to kindergarten for 6 hours a day or 5 hours a day for a few days a week. Indeed, my own dad was president of the kindergarten P&F for a number of years and used to play Santa Claus, and I well remember that as my childhood memory. But there is no doubt that I believe that one of the decline in our educational standards and even in our well-being of our children is because they're not establishing strong bonds with their parents. And I can tell you, as having 3 children of my own, parenting is a full-time job. By the time you pick the kids up after school, run them around to their various sporting activities, get them home, get them in the bath, toilet teeth, feed them, get them to do their homework and then read to them, that takes a lot of time and effort. So the importance of the stay-at-home family is the parent is very, very important, and I don't care whether it's the mother or the father. I myself volunteered to stay at home and did for a number of years. But those capital controls, getting back to the finance side here, banks need to have capital controls. They should not be allowed to lend without any regulation to anyone they want at any time. And I just spoke to a mining company this morning who wants to value-add their product here in Australia, and they can't get finance from National Australia Bank because it's too hard. And the Big Four, well, our major retail banks, are very lazy. They would much rather lend against housing than business. And that's another thing that got lifted, was that there was no restrictions or no directions as to, well, for every dollar you lend against a house, you've got to lend a dollar against a business. And of course, our loan book today has gone from, say, 40-60 housing business to something like 70-30 housing business. So a lot more money is lent against housing than actual business itself. And the last thing I want to touch on with this financial deregulation of the 80s, and something I've had a lot of experience with in my financial career, is the use of derivatives. And if anyone gets the time, you should go back and listen to last week's Country Hour, whereby a guy was on the Country Hour on the ABC talking about the derivatives market. In particular, he was referring to the cotton industry. Now, the total value of the cotton crop across the world is about $42 billion. And as this guy went on to say, he said the value of derivatives on the cotton market is much, much more than that. And it's not just the cotton market, it's most other agricultural products and metals. The value of derivatives outnumbers the value of the physical market by a factor of up to 10 to 1. Now, the reason why that matters is that when you have such a large derivative market, and I'll be more specific here, when the deregulation occurred, what it says was if you're going to take out a hedge, you no longer have to hedge it against the physical. You can basically take out uncovered hedges, or what they call, or you can call them naked shorts or whatever you like. But what that meant was that you can now create a paper market in parallel with the actual physical market. And the paper market, and indeed the biggest market in the world, is the US Treasury bond market. But when you create these paper markets, you put the power of pricing in the hands of the banks and the paper shufflers, and you take the power of pricing away from the producers. And that's not fair, because if anyone understands the way markets should work, and this is why I don't believe in free markets. I don't believe in free markets for the same reasons I don't believe in fairies in the bottom of the rose garden. It doesn't exist. What I believe in is the risk-reward paradigm, and that is actually in accordance with the Coalition's values of risk, reward for effort, because it's the people who get out of bed and put their nose to the grindstone that should be rewarded. So what we really need to do is have a look. Actually, we actually need a Senate inquiry into the financial deregulation of the 1980s, in particular in regards to unhedged derivatives, in regards to what banks can and can't do, and in regards to the way we go out and use foreign debt to basically inflate house prices whilst ignoring our underlying productivity issues. Because the financial deregulation of the 80s was accompanied by the Button Plan, which sent our manufacturing offshore. It was accompanied by the Dawkins Plan in 1990 that set our children in university so they could graduate broke and brainwashed. It was accompanied by later with the compulsory superannuation, which of course centralised $3 trillion of wealth into the hand of fund managers. Yet again, these people that skim off $30 billion a year aren't actually risking their own capital. So if we want to actually deal with the housing crisis in this country, if we want to deal with getting our children a loving home life and a good education, we need to deal with the financial misregulation that goes on in this country. Thank you.
Authorised G. Rennick People First Chermside.